that too. Go ahead.
Sounds good. We'll get started. Good morning, and thank you for participating in our hybrid meeting for the South Coast AQMD Stationary Source Committee. We have three formats for participation: in person, the Zoom application, and teleconference. Please silence your other communication devices to prevent disruptions during the meeting. In-person attendees must not connect to the Zoom application or teleconference while in the meeting room. All participants on Zoom, except for board members and South Coast AQMD staff, will be placed on mute by the host. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. After each agenda item, the chair will announce public comment. For those of you in the room, please complete a blue request to speak card and drop it in the box on the agenda table. Your name will be called when it is your turn to speak. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment on the Zoom screen, please click on the raise hand button. For those calling in by phone, you can dial *9 to signal you would like to comment. Your name or part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for public comment. The chair may provide a shorter length of time depending on the number of requests to speak received to allow everyone an opportunity to be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. If interpretation is needed, more time will be allotted. Please note you can hang up or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. Please adhere to speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. Lastly, please be aware that this video conference is being recorded. By participating in this meeting hosted by South Coast AQMD, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. That concludes the housekeeping remarks.
We got it.
Very good. We'll go ahead and wait a few minutes, get a few of the board members in here, and we'll wait for stationary source, mobile source to hopefully wrap up here soon. Like the other meeting just wrapped up. You see a couple of our board members are here. Good morning, everyone. I see a few folks there in the boardroom. I apologize for not being able to make it down there today. Got just tied up in my calendar a little too much. See, Wayne, you're coming into the room. Do we have a quorum at the moment? Can anyone hear me in the boardroom?
I'm checking to see if we have a quorum. I only see 3. Give me a minute. We have a quorum.
Okay. Oh, it's.
We'll do a roll call.
Offering. Just make
Very
me
good. We'll go ahead and do a roll call then.
co-host.
Good morning. Senator Delgado,
I'm here yet.
Vice Chair Keel. Vice Chair Keel,
She's coming over.
thank you. Board Member Padilla Campos,
Morning, present.
Vice Mayor Richardson. Absent. Supervisor Rutherford. Here. And Chair Benoit.
Here.
We have a quorum. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. We have our first item is our only item for other than informational items or other than written report, excuse me. Now we have item 403.2, fugitive dust from large roadway projects. Ian, go ahead.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you very much. Here again to talk about our proposed rule 403.2. Next slide, please. So we did bring this to the March Stationary Source Committee, and so we're just providing an update. During that meeting, we did, provide a summary and the proposed approach. We did hear from stakeholders at the time that they wanted a little bit more time to work on the rule. The committee also asked for a delay just for 1 month to try to incorporate some revisions, including for example, expanding the prohibition for material piles, in particular for sensitive receptors, to make that a larger buffer, to also require some more details on the record keeping for any dust suppressants that are used, expanding the notification area out to 1,000 feet in all cases, and then also ensuring that any activities that are related to that large roadway construction project, even if they're occurring just off-site but next door, that those are also included in the rule. Next slide, please. Great. So just a little bit about some of the more recent process that has occurred. So we have heard and been discussing a lot with a lot of the stakeholders. So right before the last committee meeting, for example, we released a lot of complaint data and put that made that available on the website. Subsequent to the last committee meeting, we also released another draft of the rule language, just trying to continue to advance that conversation, taking a lot of the concepts that we heard during committee and other items that were raised by stakeholders to try to get to a more final draft of the rule. We do expect another draft of the rule to be forthcoming, of course, in the 30-day document that will be coming up relatively soon. I'll walk through some of those changes in a bit. And we do, of course, meet pretty regularly with the stakeholders, and those have been very productive conversations. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, the applicability, this rule would apply to on-site activities associated with construction and demolition of large roadway projects. Note the word on-site. That is intended to capture the entirety of a project site, not necessarily that it's happening specifically on a roadway, but anything that is defined within a project site. The prohibitions, of course, we talked through before about aggregate crushing and grinding, and then also the material piles, large material piles, those over 8 feet in height, in this instance, to keep those buffer zones between that activity for these large roadway projects and areas of public exposure and sensitive receptors. We have other additional requirements for dust control, dust measures, and in particular signage and notification. Next slide, please. I want to talk through a few of the updates that were made to the draft rule language since we last presented to committee. So one, we talked a little bit about this, I think the last committee meeting, talking about large roadway. What is a large roadway? We did use a more common definition that stakeholders seem to all agree it makes a little bit more sense about interstates, freeways, and expressways. The large roadway project itself, again, we focused on that on-site activity for construction and demolition. Material piles, we did change this. One thing that we did here was that it's a 3-foot material pile is quite small in the context of these kinds of projects. And so we did up that to 8 feet. That is consistent with some of our other dust control rules. So we made that prohibition only for piles greater than 8 feet in height. The buffer, we did increase that buffer zone. So right now it's a 100 feet for areas of public exposure, and then 250 feet for sensitive receptors. Sensitive receptors, again, are things like homes, schools, et cetera. For dust control measures, we went and tried to make sure, one of the things we've heard a lot from stakeholders is making sure there's consistency between this rule and other dust control rules. So we went back and looked again at Rule 403 and tried to continue to make those improvements. We see that there's some controls that we had in a previous draft of this rule that are already in Rule 403. So to avoid duplication, we remove those, but those controls are already required under Rule 403 or Rule 1157, for example. But we do have some additional measures here in this rule. As far as record keeping, we have some more specific details in this draft and in the upcoming draft about asking for more information about how dust suppressants are actually applied, how long were they applied, when were they applied, and also to what areas of the project were those applied, or to what activities were those dust suppressants applied. We did expand the notification area out to 1,000 feet. And then some of the exemptions, we've added a little bit more explicit list of the minor maintenance activities that will be included in exempt projects. And we did talk through some of this during the last committee meeting. We're just a little bit more explicit now. Next slide. So the remaining key issues, there's really the central issue of concern that we've heard from stakeholders is about the buffer zone that would be required up to 250 feet now for aggregate crushing and grinding and material piles. There's real concern from many stakeholders about the increased time, cost, emissions potentially of having to relocate piles. And really feeling like that is not necessary, especially since dust control measures that are already in rules should already be sufficient. And what we have been stressing during this rulemaking is that this rule would only apply to new projects. So it's to try to make sure that planning is in place to provide that buffer zone. And so that although current sites might not be able to handle this kind of buffer zone, they weren't designed to handle buffer zones. And so Caltrans has a lot of right-of-ways. And so what might traditionally not be considered on site, if there's an available space, maybe a quarter mile, half mile away on Caltrans right-of-way, that seems like a really good opportunity to try to make sure that those protections are in place, those minimum protections are in place for this dust making activity. And so this would impose these additional buffers to protect nearby residents. What we also have seen is that while dust control measures are very effective, we know that it hasn't worked as of yet. Rule 403 does apply, Rule 1157 does apply currently, but those have not been sufficient. So this rule will add additional protections to ensure that these dust impacts are not being felt. What we've also heard is about there's some differences in different kinds of piles. So for example, excavated soil piles that are intended really just for on-site backfill, but not necessarily for aggregate crushing and grinding. Maybe those shouldn't be included, but what we do see is that if you have a very large pile of dirt, that can still create dust impacts. And so we have maintained this within the proposed rule, maintain this buffer zone for all material piles, but only those really large ones, right, over 8 feet in height. And really where the biggest impact is going to be on some of these piles is when you're building the pile, deconstructing the pile, working the pile. That's where there's going to be that dust generation potential. And so while covering a pile that is just sitting there can be effective, that cover has to come off when the pile is being worked. Then finally, we've also heard, again, this is circling around this concern about buffer zones from piles, that by having a buffer zone around large piles might mean that, well, there's going to be a lot of smaller piles instead, and those smaller piles might have their own impacts. But what this rule does is it imposes these requirements for buffer zones, control measures, et cetera, so that if there are smaller piles, those same requirements apply, so that it's really only the smallest piles that might be able to get into the buffer zone, but they still require notification, signage, and control measures to provide that protection. Next slide. So our current plan is to bring this for set hearing in May and for a public hearing in June. We are pulling that 30-day package together that will include the additional clarifications that I walked through here. We're, of course, still talking to stakeholders to try to continue to get their feedback, and we'll incorporate that into the rule as appropriate. With that, I'm available for any questions. Thank you.
Very good. Any board member questions before we take public comment? See anyone jumping up or hands raised? I'll go ahead and go to public comment. Do you have any public comment on this item? You have a hand raised. Suzanne,
Yes.
right, Sutherland.
Good morning. This is Suzanne Sifrite Sutherland from California Construction and Industrial Materials Association. We truly appreciate the district staff working with us over the last month and a half. I know we've been engaged since August of last year, but in the last month and a half, we've had a tremendous amount of communication and discussion, and we just appreciate their response. I just wanted to clarify on behalf of our industry that we've had several questions related to signage and notification, but we are not opposed to what's being proposed for those two areas. And we are also not opposed to the rule being implemented beginning January 1, 2023. The two concerns that we have outstanding at this time is in relation to the prohibition buffer and also into the material piles control measures. And I want to say our concerns are very much related. With the prohibition buffer, we're concerned about what the emissions potential may be in moving these piles. I mean, we would like to request some modeling from the district to maybe have a few sample cases where there is some comparison made for having a pile that is managed and in accordance with existing regulations that not only considers fugitive dust, but also greenhouse gas emissions, but also compare that to alternatives for moving the piles further away from the sources they're going to be used. Just to understand specifically what would the emissions reduction excess be, if there is one. We think there would be. We do agree that controls we do feel that controls and other rules are sufficient, but if they're not, it just seems like some emissions modeling would resolve that. In relation to the material piles control measure, we are proposing for the language requiring the piles to be below a maximum of 20 feet be removed. And this has to do with the same issue of creating multiple piles that could create more emissions. And in some cases, it may be practically infeasible to achieve this at sites that have been limited in relation to size, shape, and just the capacity to do that. We would like to request that the district do additional modeling. Our intention is not to push this rule out. I don't know how maybe changing some of the proposed language from this rule being implemented 6 months from adoption to 3 months really impacts the process. But that is a request we're making, and we would also like to have some additional time to work with staff on the staff report, because that is one item we have not been able to continue our communication or receive more communication from the district on. I thank you for listening and for your consideration.
Very good. Thank you, Suzanne. Any other public speakers on this item?
None.
All right, we'll go ahead and come back to staff. Has those questions or those requests been made before? And do you have any response to those as far as the modeling? The other question that was proposed as far as the height?
Sure. Let me take the first question about the modeling. I think that's something that we can add into the draft staff report. We've done some analysis already. We've done some preliminary modeling that we presented in the preliminary draft staff report. We can do some supplemental modeling in the draft staff report as well. So that would be in the 30-day package. So I think we can add that. And that's also consistent with how we would do, for example, the CEQA analysis, which is also going to be coming. And then the question about the 20-foot height. So what I think the commenter was referring to was not necessarily the buffer zone on the 8-foot height. This is a different part of the rule that says if you are within 500 feet or 1,000 feet of an area of public exposure or a sensitive receptor, that there's additional control measures that apply. You're outside of the buffer zone, but you're still close. And what that says is really trying to keep piles down from getting sort of really big. And so this says that piles need to be maintained less than 20 feet with additional controls placed on it. I think what we've heard from industry is that they'd like to keep those piles up to 30 feet in height. But given just the very short distances here, we were proposing to bring that down and provide that extra protection down so it's only 20-foot height. It's still a fairly large pile, but I think that's the concern that's being raised.
All right, board members, comments, questions?
If I could, Chair.
Please.
So I just wanted to thank staff for taking the time to really go through this in detail. I think the reduction in folks calling in with concerns is, evidence that was very fruitful. So thank you for that. The last speaker's concern about height is one that I took to be more about like the site sizes, that it might be much more difficult to try to make piles at 20 feet because of the site size, right? So that it might not be feasible. So if during the 30-day noticing period, if we could just continue to have discussions and the modeling, that would be great. But I'm supportive of moving this forward.
Very good. Board member Padilla-Campos, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanessa, for your input as well. I just wanted to thank staff. I just really appreciate the time that they take and the additional follow-up that they provide, and just overall, I just really appreciate Ian and his presentation. I had to say that, so thank you. And I'm supportive of moving this forward as well.
So as far as the height question, then board, are we all comfortable with the 20 feet? I mean, or you want to see us move to the 30 feet, or we want to have both options when we come to the meeting and discuss it there? I guess my take, oh, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, share your opinion.
I see less issues with the height if everything's being maintained appropriately, and and if everything was noticed, if there's signs up. I look back at what happened here in my city. The 30-foot versus 20 feet wasn't the bigger issue. The bigger issue was there was no signage. No one knew who to call or what to do when the dust was rolling off the piles, and when the dust was happening, no one was taking care of it. If everything else is being maintained, to me, 30 feet is a reasonable request. What does the rest of the body feel?
I was just going to say the exact same thing, that it sounded like the industry is willing to comply with the additional requirements. It's just that the size of projects might make it infeasible to stick to the 20 feet and want to go up to 30. So I'm okay as long as, again, we're doing the additional measures as well.
Yeah. How does staff feel about that? Just like to get staff's input on that question.
I think we could accommodate 30. I think we'll just want to go make sure the control measures make sense for that, but I think we can accommodate that.
Okay. And then my only other question was on the definition of an expressway. I recognize that a lot of cities and jurisdictions have different definitions of that in their local general plans. Could we maybe have language just reflect back to whatever the expressway consideration is in the local general plans, as opposed to trying to come up with our own definition? Or is staff comfortable with the definitions we have right now? Just a thought I had on one way to do that. But
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one we've grappled with of how do you define what a large roadway is. What we've been referring to is the Caltrans definition. And so we can point to another reference where it's widely accepted. We'll make sure that that's clear in the rule.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if I could ask.
Yep, go ahead.
Ian, talk a little bit more about the height and the 20-foot height. I mean, if we're limiting it to 20 feet, they're still going to have this material and they're going to put it somewhere else, which means it's going to be on trucks driving through neighborhoods to other sites. So I'm trying to see how we decide that 20 feet is the best balance of all of that.
But I think the rest of us were all comfortable with moving to 30.
Well, even if we move to 30, I mean, what are the heights now? What are the average heights now? And how do you, and what happens with the excess material when you change from wherever they are now to 30 or 20 or anything else?
What we've heard from industry is that 30 is a height that they often use because that's where typical equipment can get up to 30 feet. The larger piles that you would see, for example, at a quarry, that requires specialized equipment that you wouldn't necessarily see here. What the thinking behind it really was recognizing that there are these challenges of just everything being close. It's really a unique environment, a unique kind of project. So trying to just look, how can we provide that extra protection? So it was really just on that basis of trying to say, okay, let's take it down a little bit so that it's not such a large pile. That's really the thinking behind it. But that's where I think, you know, if the pleasure of the committee is to go to 30, I think we can accommodate that. And that I think that's what we've heard from industry is that 30 is a sensible height limit for this kind of project.
Does the proposal include limiting the number of 30-foot piles?
The number of piles is not included, or the surface area, total surface area. That's not really part of the proposal right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we have the input we need and we're ready to move forward then. This is just an informational item. Unless staff had any other questions they wanted us to answer, but I think we're good. All right, we have our written reports that are attached, items 2 through 4, or sorry, 2 through 5. Does anyone have any questions on those items? No? Okay, well, looks like we're getting caught back up on time for the technical committee. So with that, there's other business. Any board members have any other business they'd like to bring up? Rex, did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Happy Easter.
You
Wishing
too.
you all a good Friday and a happy Easter weekend.
You're here.
Happy Passover, happy Ramadan. We've got them all this week.
Absolutely. Passover, Ramadan, all of it.
Very good. All right. Do we have any general public comment for items that are not on the agenda? I do see Carl Laney. Go ahead, Carl. Carl, we're just hearing a few clicks. Go ahead. Try again, maybe. Mr. Laney, we're not hearing anything on this side. You're muted on your side. Staff, are we able to see what's going on there? Or?
He's unmuted. It's just we weren't able to hear anything.
All right, Carl, we'll go ahead and go to the next speaker, Michael Lewis, and we'll come back to you. Michael Lewis, you have your hand raised for items that are not on the agenda for general public comment.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to shed a little bit of light on that, the question of the 30-foot piles. And that's something that, the construction industry supports. The reason being is that these portable crushing plants are all pretty standard throughout the industry, and the belt that comes out of the plant that piles the crushed material creates a 30-foot, it's 30 feet high. So it will create a pile up to 30 feet high. It's not going to exceed that. In the ag, if you were at a mining facility where you see the big crushing operations, they create very, very high piles. But in the portable field, all you're going to get at max is a 30-foot pile. And what we wanted to see was something that focused on controlling the dust, not the height of the pile, because we were concerned that we were going to have an inspector coming out who was with his tape measure, and he was going to be, the machine creates a pile that will be just under 30 feet if you run it to the max. And we didn't want to have an argument about the height of the pile when what we really wanted was assurance that we'd be controlling the dust from the pile. So I think the 30 foot, it makes a lot more sense because it's sort of the industry standard, and you're going to be able to focus on the real purpose of the rule, which is controlling the dust, not arguing about whether the pile's 20 feet high or 22 feet high or 25 feet high or whatever the case might be. So I think that's a good choice, and we would support that. So I thank you for having that discussion.
Thank you, Michael. Yep, we've made that recommendation to staff, so that should be part of the 30-day package when it moves forward. So. All right. Any other public comments for items not on the agenda? I recognize maybe you folks might have missed the earlier public comment period. I don't see our other hand raised. Maybe you had the same comment. All right. Our next station resource meeting will be Friday, May 20th at 10:30, and hopefully a few more of us can make it into the boardroom. My apologies for not making it today. I had a bit of a time challenge myself. So with that, as I said earlier, happy Ramadan, happy Easter, and all the other great stuff that's going on this week. So want to have a great holiday and a great weekend.
Thank you all. Take care.
All right, we're going right into tech. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.